basically they're treating the federal government like a piñata. They're letting Elon Musk, I guess, is holding the piñata, but he's letting different sections of the capitalist class all take a swing. I mean, the Democrats are total capitalists. The reason why the Democrats are putting up really no fight right now is because the Democrats themselves are built on their own section of billionaires and bankers and corporations.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Donald Trump is back. And this time, it's Trump 2.0 on steroids. His administration and its allies are setting the stage for a radical transformation of U.S. politics, reshaping the state, gutting institutions, consolidating power, and even turning on factions within the ruling class itself. From Elon Musk's growing influence over U.S. policy to the Republican Party's internal war on the so-called radical left Democratic Party as they see it, the contradictions within the American empire are reaching a breaking point. Trump's people are dismantling key mechanisms of soft power, alienating U.S. allies, and laying the groundwork for military action against Mexico. Meanwhile, their push for mass deportations threatens the very economy that relies on undocumented labor, raising the question, who actually benefits from all this? Are we watching an empire in decline or a reactionary reconfiguration of power? And how should those of us who oppose U.S. imperialism make sense of these contradictions? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Breakthrough News Editor-in-Chief, Ben Becker. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. So Ben Becker, welcome to Dispatches.
Thanks, Rania.
It's your Dispatches debut. I'm very excited.
Yes.
It's been a long time coming, and you're coming on for a really important, massive topic because we have entered Trump administration 2.0. It's completely insane so far, as is expected, but I think it's also really confusing for a lot of people. So I know you don't have all the answers or like a crystal ball, but hopefully you can help us come to some sort of logical understanding of what the hell is going on right now. So let's start with the ruling class itself and all the contradictions that we see playing out right now. You have Trump and his inner circle who seem to be making these moves that contradict, on the surface at least, the broader interests of U.S. elites. And there's like different aspects of this. So my question for you is this just factional infighting, or are we seeing a deeper crisis within the U.S. ruling class?
Well, I mean, the answer is both, I think, if that's allowed. I think we have to really think about what does the term the ruling class even mean. I mean, it's true that we always use this phrase. The left uses it a lot. There obviously is a class of people who are super rich and control the institutions that control society. So there obviously is a ruling class, like objectively it exists. But how it comes together politically is a far more complicated process. And so I think, in a kind of cartoonish way, we can think about like a smoke-filled room where all the rich people get together and they decide these are our long-term interests, these are our short-term interests, and so forth. But in fact, the ruling class is it's always made up of factions, and it always rules via coalition. This is actually something that Karl Marx himself spent a long time studying. He once called the capitalists a band of warring brothers, or a band of hostile brothers. And I think it's actually kind of appropriate this day and age, because a lot of these guys, and they're almost all guys, they went to school together, they know each other, their kids go to the same private schools, some were in the same fraternities, they belong to the same think tanks. A lot of this is like score settling within a very small group, like sort of clique of society. But on the other hand, there are distinct interests. And so, for instance, Silicon Valley and finance capital are not identical. The military industrial complex is not identical. The energy corporations are not identical to all the others. They all have shared interests when it comes to, I'd say, empire. And they have shared interests when it comes to disciplining the working class and not paying a lot of taxes. So there are things that allow them to come together as a class. And then and they're generally pretty class conscious, more class conscious than the working class. They recognize that they have shared interests. But in terms of how to rule, what policy should be in place to rule, what to do at every moment, which sector of capital has to give something up for long-term stability, they're actually quite hostile to each other, and it can be, a pretty sharp and bitter conflict. So I think we're seeing a sharpness of the conflict inside that ruling class in a way that it kind of had been papered over or mollified by the kind of Washington blob of institutions, and now Trump is going to war with that blob of institutions, and it's exposing really this hostile band of brothers, as Karl Marx put it.
I mean, I love that hostile band of brothers, because one of the brothers who has gotten a lot of power so far in the Trump administration is Elon Musk, who's, one of many billionaires who are a part of this ruling class. But obviously a certain faction also doesn't like him. So I guess, can you situate Elon Musk in what you just described? How should we understand him? And also the disproportionate power that he now has over U.S. economic policy specifically, especially with this kind of taking over the Treasury Department in the way he has, and implementing I still don't know how to pronounce it. Is it Doge? I'm going to go with Doge. You can correct me on that. Yeah. But usually, we're used to seeing many billionaires benefit from government handouts. So why does it seem increasingly concentrated specifically in just this one person's hands? Does this also signal that kind of split within the ruling class you just described?
Yes. I mean, I think that he represents the kind of stage of political deterioration that the U.S. ruling class is at, and the U.S. electoral system. I mean, he invested nearly $300 million in the election. One man, $300 million. So you have to ask yourself, if you're investing $300 million in one electoral cycle, what are you getting in return? Because he's a capitalist. He's going to invest with the expectation of some sort of return. And others have pointed out the amount of government contracts that are going to Musk-affiliated corporations is through the roof. The fact that investigations into his companies are being put on hold, or the actual investigative units that are going after Musk are just being folded up completely. So he does have a lot personally at stake. But the fact that one person could have such an influence, standing at the cabinet meeting, basically getting a whole new agency created just for him to rule, and then it becomes kind of this super agency that can invade all the other institutions and bureaucracies, it is really quite remarkable. Musk himself, I think, is formed by his experience as an ultra-rich white South African. I think he has kind of an ideological crusade in his own way. He's not thinking about the long-term interests of the U.S. ruling class. I don't think he's really that familiar with U.S. history at all. I don't think I actually don't. I mean, the idea of him as sort of an evil genius, I think, is not correct. A lot of his companies are losing money. Twitter has lost, by some estimates, 50 to 60% of its value since he took over. But again, that's sort of an influence investment. He's been able to use Twitter and his electoral contributions to really have this outsized influence, which of course was a long time coming with Citizens United and other Supreme Court cases that paved the way for this. So in a way, it's a perfect representation that you could have sort of a kind of somewhat psychotic, ultra-rich white South African kind of take over aspects of the U.S. political system based on his self-confidence, and I think a lot of these sort of Silicon Valley libertarian style, they really do have like this almost eugenicist concept of themselves and their families as like the super smart geniuses who are going to lead us into outer space, and other people just don't get it, and they're really contemptuous of sort of all the existing social contract that exists in society, and they feel that if they're basically empowered to take over and everyone steps out their way, that they'll sort of lead us into the promised land, where of course they'll make billions and in fact now trillions of dollars. So I could see that he annoys Trump. You can see in some of the pictures. Undoubtedly, he has to be highly annoying to other ruling class figures. But for now, he's getting his return on his investment. I mean, Trump may kick him to the side at some point, and I don't think it will change the fundamental character of the Trump administration. He's really just one of the many factions that have now aligned behind Trump.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned eugenicists, because one of the reasons Elon Musk has so many children is because he thinks that superior humans should make more of themselves. It's like a kind of eugenicism, actually, because they're so superior, and the only way to continue having superior, like, ruling class leaders is to, like, continue to procreate if you're one of the superiors. He tweets constantly about, or he was months ago, about sort of underpopulation, the fertility rates, and those things. On the same page, then he's also talking about how we should keep immigrants out. So it's sort of like, underpopulation for who then? You know, if you're worried about underpopulation and you want to keep immigrants out, which is usually how countries with aging populations are able to replenish their workforces, then maybe there's something else behind that. But a lot of these, like, kind of weird theories, that they're not actually so weird in U.S. politics. There's whole sort of conspiratorial right-wing groups that have mass followings. The John Birch Society, famously, which in a way have moved from the fringes to really the center of like Republican ideology. It's actually making people go back and like revisit these sort of old conspiratorial, conservative, hardcore anti-communist organizations and see how they've actually sort of taken over politically. So I want to pivot a little bit to international issues, and then we're going to come back to the domestic stuff, because especially to elaborate on some of what you just said about Republicans specifically. But something that I think has gotten the most attention so far, I guess it's on any given day with Trump, there's like sort of a whiplash effect depending on what he's doing that day, but it has been the destruction of soft power, and not all soft power mechanisms. And I don't even know, maybe destruction is too powerful of a word to use there, but Trump's administration has been hollowing out key soft power institutions like USAID, I mean, to a significant degree. So I'm curious your thoughts on this. Is this just a different Republican strategy for maintaining empire? Because we know Republicans and Democrats, obviously they have the same agenda and end goal. They just sometimes have different ideas of how we should get there. And Democrats do cling on harder to those soft power elements, though Republicans use them too. But is this just a strategy shift, or do you think it reflects more of a fundamental shift in how U.S. imperialism operates and wants to operate in the future?
I think for now it's a strategy shift, but if they were to succeed at totally destroying these institutions, and if they were able to, for instance, win again in 4 years, it could become a more fundamental shift. I think you have to go back to the origins of these institutions to really understand why they came about, and that helps us understand maybe why certain sections of the capitalist class, the ultra rich, would want to dispense with them now. So they're really funded in the Cold War period. And so, for instance, USAID comes out, is John F. Kennedy who creates it in the early 1960s. He was heavily influenced by a book, actually, by a high-level Navy official, William Lederer, who wrote a book called The Ugly American. And it's about a fictional place in Southeast Asia where William Lederer and others were functioning. And they saw that basically the State Department was so condescending, so ostentatious in their wealth, so dismissive of local cultures, so dismissive of the need to develop in especially the third world and the global South, that they were losing the competition to the Soviet Union, that the communists were better at diplomacy, the communists could speak more about national liberation and sovereignty, the communists were able to speak more to the development needs of largely agrarian societies. And so this novel was basically a call to action for the Washington elite that we need to do better because we're losing the Cold War in these places in the global South. Now, remember, the 1950s and 1960s, this is the prime period of these anti-colonial revolutions. So John F. Kennedy, who earlier in his career was actually against foreign aid, reads the book. Then when he comes into office, he's looking at especially Vietnam, where there's a very fierce competition. He's looking at Latin America, where there's just been the Cuban Revolution. And he's saying we are going to lose the global South, or what was then called the Third World, to the Soviet Union unless we create different types of institutions. And the State Department was usually kind of clunky and slow and bureaucratic when it came to giving out aid. So they created USAID. Kennedy actually wanted it to still be basically an instrument of the Cold War. He said, this is a way that we can build up free market economies, build up capitalist democracies. We'll have basically this huge pool of money, similar to what they did in Europe after World War II, where they took the Marshall Plan, this was before USAID, and they rebuilt all the capitalist countries so that they wouldn't fall to communism. Now, over time, once you've sort of created this pool of money as an anti-communist institution, there are people in USAID who say, actually, we should have development for development's sake, that it's actually good for the world, it's good for humanity, it sort of stabilizes things. It's not just like a hardcore political instrument. And USAID starts to develop kind of its independence from the State Department. So, by putting the USAID back under the State Department, it's not totally a novel thing. Even Bill Clinton himself, a Democrat, in other words, wanted to bring USAID under the State Department. It's this huge, it's a fairly large institution, huge pool of money. So they say it should be under political control. So my point being that a lot of these international institutions were created in a particular historical moment. A was how to subordinate Europe and the other Western sort of capitalist countries, the developed countries. That's where we have a lot of the Bretton Woods institutions, the UN, the IMF, the Marshall Plan. A lot was created during that period. And then later in the 1950s and 1960s, institutions that are really trying to vie for the loyalty and the leadership of the global South. So I think that there are people around Trump, and he's not the first one. Many Republican sort of hard right figures have been saying for decades that this thing is a money waste. We don't need to be in these international institutions. We don't even need to be in the UN, some of them said. And Elon Musk said it a few days ago. We should just leave the UN. Amazing. These were institutions that were created basically for the US to be, this was the velvet glove over the iron fist. And so many in the US leadership realized that it was better to lead with an iron fist and a velvet glove. But now the Cold War is over. Yeah. I think many in Trump's world say that the unipolar world is over too. And when you're in the unipolar world, you also have sort of management responsibilities to kind of keep everybody happy, so to speak, the different sort of local leaders of the different countries. We're in a different moment, and we should go back to just the iron fist, go back to bullying. And so that has a long history too. Trump isn't the first one to say this. This was Jesse Helms in the 1980s, hardcore Southern segregationist, who was totally against USAID, wanted to destroy it. This was Robert Taft, Herbert Hoover, previous Republican presidents. When in the 1940s, they were against NATO. They said, we don't need NATO. NATO is just expensive. We have a giant ocean between us and the Soviet Union. Let Europe deal with the Soviet Union. That's not our problem. So he's really pulling at different threads that have been pushed to the sides in the Republican Party, but are now kind of coming back to the center. Now have taken over again.
Interesting. Because then you look at, this goes along with what you're seeing in terms of the way he's acting in various parts of the world with so-called allies, right? Because, Trump's not just pissing off, American adversaries, which America always does, but is also angering traditional U.S. allies. We've seen this in Latin America. We've seen this in the Middle East, recently with Gaza. Do you think this is a reckless deviation from imperial strategy, or does it go along with the sort of iron fist that you're talking about, where he just believes the U.S. no longer needs to maintain these relationships in the same way? You've kind of already answered that, but feel free to elaborate. But in that case, could this actually, regardless of what the reason is, could this actually weaken U.S. global power in the long run? because I'm of a few minds here. We think about what we just saw with that Zelensky-Trump meeting, which was very theatrical, but it's like nothing we've ever seen, right? Like you had him just going off, and then JD Vance joined in to basically tell Zelensky like give him the middle finger. In quite a child tantrum like way. It was kind of shocking. But I would imagine that if you're a US ally in other parts of the world and you're watching that after so much investment in the war in Ukraine and so much backing of Zelensky and propping him up, to then see him treated like that at the White House would make you think like, oh, maybe they're going to do that to me. I don't know. I'm just wondering,
Definitely.
like, is this something that might weaken US global power ultimately?
I think it definitely could. I think that's why big sections of the existing sort of political establishment in the United States didn't want Trump, especially in 2016 and again in 2024, is they see him as a long-term destabilizing force, and that that matters to them quite a bit. Definitely, other countries are seeing that and feeling they could be next, but Trump is basically taking the view that it doesn't really matter. It's better to be feared than loved. And it's sort of like, is it better to run a neighborhood as a mafia don, or as sort of a elected like mayor who looks like you're friendly, but then also cuts deals on the side? I don't know, maybe there's an imperfect metaphor, but Trump sort of is more comfortable in the mafia don sort of cutout. And I think he feels it doesn't really matter. And if the US were to basically proclaim itself to be an empire instead of hiding that it's an empire, that's what he's doing. He says we should conquer Canada, reseize the Panama Canal, this like open expansionism, open imperialism in Gaza. I think his view is that, yeah, the U.S. is an empire. Maybe he's not quite at the point of saying it outright, but it's basically saying it outright. We're an empire, and people have to pay tribute to us. And so they created all these institutions that sort of mask that fundamental reality. People are paying tribute in different ways, by using the US dollar, by hosting US military bases, by basically taking US goods from all over the world, the cultural hegemony of the US. They've already been an empire, but they had a lot of institutions to sort of soften the edges, and he's taking away those soft edges.
And then I'm wondering if it might also, I mean, I'm not, I know I'm kind of asking you to look into a crystal ball here, so we can only speculate. But when you see what he's doing with other allies, for example, you look at the Middle East with this issue with Gaza. I mean, in all of the time that the genocide in Gaza was going on, I think Trump's attempt to ethnically cleanse Gaza officially and send Palestinians to like Egypt and Jordan brought together all the countries for the first time to discuss how that's a really awful thing to do, only because it impacted them. But then you had all these US allies, these monarchies and police states, getting together and actually collaborating on how to make sure this doesn't happen, which is kind of like the blowback effect, I guess I'm talking about. And then you look at a country like Mexico, where, I mean, I know that there's been a bit more of a rift between the US and Mexico with the ascension of a party like Morena and someone like AMLO and now Claudia Sheinbaum. But that said, Mexico is still an ally of the US and has a very close relationship with the US. But now you have the Trump administration listing the or categorizing cartels, Mexican drug cartels, as foreign terrorist organizations, openly laying the groundwork for potential drone strikes in Mexico. And I mean, it just seems like, to me, these kinds of attempts at the sort of mobster, mafia don-like attitude towards allies could actually have the impact of turning them against you and actually radicalizing them against you.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably in their hearts, they've already turned against them. A lot of these countries' leaderships. I mean, there's the saying that it's like it's dangerous to be an enemy of the U.S., but it's fatal to be its friend. And I think a lot of them feel, and even the longstanding U.S. sort of supporter in Mexico under Porfirio Diaz said, so close to America, so far from God. So this was a pro-U.S. Mexican leadership who recognized how, basically it was a misfortune of the Mexican people to be situated right next to the U.S. But with that being said, it's the largest trading partner of the U.S. is Mexico, and the largest trading partner of Mexico is the United States. So in both sense, there's a mutual dependency. The U.S. also, I think they're tied now, Mexico and Canada, in terms of their trade relationships with the U.S. But the U.S., for all of its sort of sprawling global empire, its primary trading partners are Mexico and Canada, along with China, the three countries that are now being hit with tariffs. So it's a highly risky economic strategy on the part of Trump. I think Mexico also has to fear military intervention in some respects, or has to at least think about it as a country that was repeatedly invaded. It's true actually throughout the Western Hemisphere. I mean, I think it's almost all the countries, maybe 2/3 to 3/4 of the countries in the Western Hemisphere, their main trading partner is the United States. Even Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, the primary exporter, the primary country taking its oil was still the United States. So the fact that Trump can come down, for instance, on Gustavo Petro and say, you're going to have tariffs on your country. Trump unilaterally says, I'm going to put these giant tariffs on your country if you don't accept deportation flights, for instance. It has a real impact in a country like Colombia, whose largest trading partner is the United States, and so the U.S. has all these tools that it can, kick people out of financial systems, sanctions, tariffs, military invasions. So even though I think people are trying to hedge their bets to a larger extent, and will now hedge their bets even more. In other words, they'll think about China, they'll think about Russia, they'll think about sort of a multipolar relationship. The fact is, the financial system and the military reality is still such an overbearing one that the U.S. Can sort of, throw its weight around quite a bit. And so even while in some ways it hurts the long-term interest for them to throw around their weight so crudely, in Trump's mind, and I think Trump is really not an ideological person. I think Trump is really about paying tribute. He wants his family to be like a great American family. He wants to go down as like this great rich president. I think the short term, it looks like it's succeeding. And I think for him, that's all that really matters.
If you have a conscience, it's unbearable to be plugged into the corporate media machine right now. These outlets are accomplices in genocide, running cover for the war machine. Breakthrough has become the go-to outlet for those who want something different. But the funds we've used to start this platform are starting to run out. We'd never dream of turning to mainstream corporate funding. So we're turning to you. Become a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you can become an essential part of our fight to not just break through the mainstream media, but create something that can challenge it. We have to become completely viewer supported, or this platform we've built could go away. Don't just watch us, join us.
Yeah. Well, I want to zoom back into the domestic front because another thing that I think this will actually maybe harm U.S. empire in the long run as well. And, sometimes, Ben, when I'm looking at what is being done domestically, it kind of reminds me or gives me the vibes of like post-Soviet Union. In terms of the way these vultures kind of went into all these post-Soviet, the oligarchy went into these post-Soviet countries and just sold off every state asset imaginable and then bought it for like pennies. And it was horrific what ended up happening to people. I mean, there was like starvation, mass unemployment, just people died, like millions of people died as a result. But where I'm going with that is, his administration is going after universities and even specifically targeting the Department of Education. And we've talked about this before. The U.S. is virtually alone among major powers in really not valuing a centralized education system, which is just bizarre. But there's a reason for this. And this kind of goes back to what you were talking about with the Republican Party in many ways and what's driving it. Why is attacking the Department of Education such a priority for the right? And how does this fit into the broader project of that sort of libertarian mindset of dismantling state institutions? And ultimately, do you think that'll be bad for empire?
I mean, you'd think when you look at, for instance, China as a peer competitor or whatever, you would think that the U.S. would say, okay, we need to have a strong centralized education system so we can go toe to toe and develop more engineers, more scientists, more everything to go head to head with China, which has a highly centralized education system. But no. And I think, there are a few other developed countries that have decentralized education systems, but not many. And it has to deal with the peculiar and particular history of the United States, in fact. And a lot of it has to do with the history of racism and white supremacy in the country, that it was actually, they didn't want to educate young Black and brown boys and girls. That wasn't their place in life, was not to have equal opportunities and equal jobs. They were being tracked for low wage work in the fields, in the factories, and so forth. So there was a big fight to even get public education system at the local and state level in the United States, but there still was not a federal education department. The first real move towards a federal education department came during Reconstruction. And it was basically formerly enslaved people and the legislators, the representatives in the South, because the number one demand of the freed slaves was for education, actually more than land. But there wasn't enough local revenue to fund those schools. And so there was a demand for the federal government to take responsibility to make sure there was equal right to education. The libertarians and others have this view. Really, the whole conservative movement has the view that, look, there's nothing about education in the Constitution. Remember, the Constitution basically defines negative liberties. You're free from government and X, Y, and Z, but you don't actually have the right to anything. There's nothing about housing or healthcare or education in the US Constitution, which is one of the longest standing constitutions in the world. So to the extent there are rights to anything, they've had to be sort of added on, but not in the Constitution itself, added on through these agencies. The Department of Education, though, isn't created until the Carter administration. So that's 100 years later. And really, education funding from the federal level doesn't come until the late 1960s as part of the civil rights movement. Again, this sort of this incomplete dream of the formerly enslaved people of the South was to have the federal government take responsibility to level the playing field for education, so to speak. And it was bitterly opposed by those sort of white racist politicians in the South. But then, of course, there are others who are just, don't want to pay into that. They just want lower taxes and so forth. So I think it does have to do with a particular racial history that the U.S. actually does not want to ensure equal rights to education. That's not really how they see their global competition with China either. That was sort of the battle over the H-1B visas. When you think about it, the U.S. has never seen a problem that if you go into almost any public hospital in any urban area, it's not representative of the people who are in there. There's very few Black doctors. There's very few Latino doctors. The U.S. view of education is we can basically import highly skilled people from the global South, have basically a brain drain, and then we don't have to pay for the education. And the people who are poor and have always been poor will stay poor. And I think there's a sort of almost an explicit, but at least an implicit racism in the whole thing, which is that the Black and Latino people in this country are not really equal Americans. And I mean, people are always going to sort of roll their eyes these days because how Trump has sort of taken the offensive against affirmative action, against civil rights, against DEI. But the truth is, there are such historical inequalities on the basis of race in this country that there were reforms that were introduced in the 1960s and 70s that the whole U.S. ruling class, with the exception of these sort of fringe elements, basically accepted we need to do this or the country is going to explode. There's going to be a revolution, and it also looks terrible in the global South when we say we want to compete for the leadership of Africa or the Middle East or Latin America, and we have these generations upon generations of historically impoverished communities. Hey, maybe we should take responsibility for giving them some good schools, or at least funding their schools. Because if everything is based on local and state taxes, what goes into education, it'll just keep reproducing the same class and racial system. So for a big section of U.S. elites, they already send their kids to private school, or they're sending them to these suburban schools that almost look like private schools. They're like castles. So for them, when they see the gutting of public education, they know that's not going to affect them. The gutting of the federal education funding, that's not going to affect their families. That's going to affect the tens of millions of young people in this country who are in poverty or near poverty. It's literally tens of millions. So right now there's something called Title I under the Education Department funding, where the federal government provides the funding to those schools in addition to state and local taxes. So if they're able to gut the federal Department of Education, it remains to be seen what happens to those funding flows. So what Trump would like to do, and I'm sorry, this is a long answer, but it's kind of a complicated question.
It's important.
What Trump and his team would like to do with so-called school choice is deliver block grants. So instead of saying we're going to fund the specific schools to make sure that they and the school districts, to make sure they have the funding for their schools, we're just going to give all the money we would have given to those schools sort of as federal oversight to make sure that they all have it. We're just going to give it to the states. But if you give it to some Republican state, which a lot of these poor states are Republican states, they can then start to dole out that money to people who say it's for private schools or religious schooling or homeschooling and charter schools in particular. And the charter schools will become a massive investment for Wall Street, for hedge funds and so forth. So it's basically another more sneaky and subtle way of transferring this enormous pool of money into private hands instead of to Black and Latino, like kids.
God, the U.S. ruling class is the most stingy ruling class in history, I swear to God. Well, speaking to what you were just talking about, I mean, you mentioned DEI. The Trump right is using DEI as an excuse for why anything and everything goes wrong, one, but also to purge Black leadership from places like even the Pentagon or the military. We even saw them blaming DEI for planes crashing. I mean, it's completely insane. I guess if we have Black pilots, it's a bad thing. How does this obsession with DEI benefit the ruling class, or maybe it doesn't? Is this just racism, or is there a broader strategy at play here that I'm just not understanding?
I think there is a lot of just racism. I mean, sometimes we are always looking for some deeper thing. Sometimes it's just racism. I think a lot of them feel that that's just, we don't need Black people flying planes. We need Black people in menial jobs. I mean, I think there is that element of it. But, look at the plane crash. It was kind of convenient because he changed the conversation from the other sort of structural problems with the regulations being gutted around the FAA, the sort of control towers that have been defunded, the high turnover rate, the fact that they're understaffed and so forth. So there's always an element of sort of using real sort of oppression, but then also having it as a form of distraction. I think DEI is also, insofar as it's kind of like a regulatory apparatus on top of the old corporate control. A lot of these corporations followed the government's suit in introducing DEI, quote unquote DEI, and it really didn't benefit, the great mass of Black and Latino workers, but it did sort of create diversity in certain spaces. And I think there is a resentment that the idea that we have some obligation to make up for society's inequalities, that's not our responsibility. That's how a lot of people in corporate America view it. And who is anybody to pressure me into, who to hire and what to say? And I want to go back to being able to say whatever I want in the office and not have to look over my shoulder at what some woman's going to say or what some Black person's going to think about me or being written up or there being some little office where you can go complain about me. I want to go back to the good old days. And so I think it's actually more popular than you might imagine in the sort of upper echelons, the idea that Trump is waging this war on it, because then they get to pull back all their DEI offices too to stay in line with Trump. So in a way, it's sort of like a little goodie that you're giving to the ultra rich, but it is going to have a big impact in terms of the lives of Black, Latino professionals in particular. I think people who have been working their whole lives and earned it are now all being looked at as quote unquote DEI hires. People are being fired systematically. I saw that the Pentagon was not going to be sending a recruiter to the Black Engineers Association event of the year. So the Pentagon no longer wants to recruit Black engineers because they've decided to group together as Black engineers. I mean, it is kind of insane. The Pentagon is the most diverse employer.
It's really a multicultural institution. Like, seriously.
It's the most diverse employer in the country. And obviously the U.S. military has big shortfalls in recruitment, has to basically project its power all over the world. So it being seen as an equal opportunity employer is a pretty important thing for the stability of the U.S. empire. But don't tell Pete Hegseth. He doesn't seem to really care. He's a crusader.
He self-described crusader. And I think this goes back to the sort of right-wing radicalization that we've seen take place over the years. It really seems like many Republicans, first of all, they seem to really believe, like, I think they actually do believe that Democrats are not just radical leftists, as they say, but actual communists. Like, I think that there's some of them, I mean, some of them, maybe it's just a talking point, it's red meat. I think some of them really believe it.
No, they do.
Yeah. Do you think, which is like hilarious to people like us, but, you know, have these people just been radicalized by their own media and algorithmic feedback loop? Like, why do they think that? And also, like, what are the ultimate consequences of this? Because it just seems like it can't be good for them at the end of the day if they really believe that Democrats are communists.
Yeah, I mean, the Democrats are total capitalists. The reason why the Democrats are putting up really no fight right now is because the Democrats themselves are built on their own section of billionaires and bankers and corporations. And so the only way to really go at the Republicans would be on a class basis right now, but they're unable to do it because that would alienate their section of billionaires and corporations. So obviously, to think about George Soros as a Marxist, I mean, you got to be kidding me. I mean, George Soros engineered some of the color revolutions against, the socialist camp. And he's an arch capitalist. I mean, you don't get more capitalism. He said he wouldn't even invest in China, remember, a few years ago. So, but people like Russell Vought, who's an extremely important person, extremely influential now in the Trump administration, actually believes that the Democrats are communists. And it is totally wild. I think in some ways they've gotten high on their own supply of propaganda, that is.
High on their own supply.
But
I like that.
But on the other hand, I also think that the social media world, the social media environment has allowed, in a way, people who could be kept to the margins sort of institutionally, it's allowed them to build up mass followings. Yeah. And then they become influential. And a lot of these people have always been there. I think that some of them were sort of let into the Trump first administration a little bit. But now in Trump 2, they've been given the reins of power. But you look at the Heritage Foundation, that's not some marginal fringe organization. Mm-hmm. That is an extremely important organization that Russell Vought comes out of. It's been long influential in picking judges. You look at an organization like ALEC, which drafts really the legislation for all the state legislators to introduce. Hard right has long been pumping out this stuff. So I think it's always been there. It's just they've been kept from the central leadership of the Washington elite. And they've especially been powerful at the state level and through these think tanks, but now they've got it all. Basically, they're treating the federal government like a piñata, and they're basically letting everyone come take a swing at it. All their friends. They're letting Elon Musk, I guess, is holding the piñata, but he's letting different sections of the capitalist class all take a swing at it. But I do think some of them really think the Washington elite are like hidden communists. And this really goes back to, again, I mentioned the John Birch Society. Mm-hmm. You know, in the late 1950s, you had the like USAID type people like John F. Kennedy, who said, now's the time we have to turn towards soft power. But you had another grouping, which was like hard right, very influential in the Republican Party, sort of grassroots, who said all of these institutions are just communist institutions. Eisenhower is a secret communist. USAID is communist. Peace Corps is communist. The UN is communist. Fluoride in the water is communist. And, you know, all of that stuff, as crazy as it seemed, those people became very influential later on down the road in the Republican Party. You hear you can hear the echo of all that stuff all these years later in a lot of these talking points.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, You can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.